I'd like to welcome you tonight to tonight's Schoenberg Institute and Herbert D. Katz Center's Distinguished Fellows Lecture in Jewish Manuscript Studies. The Sims-Katz Fellowship, which we like to call it for short, is the result of a happy and fruitful collaboration, now in its 7th year, between the two centers and with the Jewish Studies program, who's sponsoring tonight's lecture. Each year, we pair a distinguished scholar in Jewish studies with a manuscript or a group of manuscripts in our collections, and the result, we hope, is an enriched understanding of the significance of the manuscript or the manuscripts to Jewish studies, and an opportunity for us in the Schoenberg Institute to gain new insights into these unique artifacts of our shared intellectual and cultural heritages. We're delighted to welcome our fellow this year, Elisheva Carlebach from Columbia University, who's our speaker tonight. And before we introduce her, I'm going to hand you over to my wonderful colleague at the Katz Center, Natalie Dorman.
Part of the tradition in this lecture is a big lineup of introducers before we get to the speaker. So we'll peel back the onion and it will be a great reveal. Good evening. My name is Natalie Dorman, and I'm the Associate Director of the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies here at Penn. The Katz Center, as Lynn said, has had the great pleasure of partnering with SIMS to develop this initiative over the past 7 years. And by SIMS, I mean the whole team here, but I really mean especially Lynn Ransom, the incomparable Lynn Ransom, and our third musketeer is Arthur Quiron. And the three of us have had a wonderful time building this lecture series and choosing our most brilliant people to bring in, and it's been a great joy. The Katz Center, if you don't know, it is an institute at Penn that's located down on Independence Mall, and is in the business of supporting the humanistic study of Jewish history and culture at the highest levels, each year welcoming 20 internationally prominent scholars to Philadelphia who participate in a research fellowship built around a common theme. But as Lynn has said, this evening's event celebrates a particular unique fellowship that's under the Katz Center's roof as well, one that brings together two of our institutions, our shared institutions' finest resources. Katz Centers bring the fellows, and the library brings these extraordinary manuscripts. So each year we try to pair an exciting scholar with these treasures, and the scholar is given time to live with the manuscript. We really are interested in the ways that historians look at material texts and draw out not just their content, but what the physicality of these documents also can teach us about the past. I want to spend a little minute, and if you'll indulge me, telling you about our past fellows, because this lineup is quite extraordinary. Our previous Sims-Katz fellows have shared absolutely extraordinary research with us and have revealed a lot of new ways to understand the manuscripts that we are so lucky to hold here in our collections. I'm going to tell you about a few of them, in part so that you can hurry home and binge watch all their lectures, which are stored on our YouTube channel, ours and yours, so please look for them there. But we have had, every one of these names is amazing. Zvi Lungerman from Bar Ilan in Israel, he looked at a medieval medical miscellany and read the doctor's notes in the margins in 12 languages and traced medicine and botany and lexicography all around the medieval Mediterranean. Judith Ojlowi-Schlenger was here from Paris and Oxford, and she did a masterclass on Hebrew paleography from the Cairo Geniza, extraordinary work. Fabrizio Lely, now at La Sapienza in Rome, talked about Hebrew manuscripts that explored the very first mention of the New World by Jews in Europe and looked at the whole mapping and imagination of a cosmos in the age of discovery. Elizabeth Hollander from Goethe and the Goethe University in Frankfurt, she took hold of a medieval Ashkenazi prayer book that was burned and cut and had handwritten notes and missing pages and stolen illuminations. And she read a history of this community and its liturgy out of this document. It was really a tour de force. Alessandro Guetta from Paris found Renaissance architectural ideas translated into drawings of the temple in Renaissance Talmud pages. And Shalom Sabar last year, if some of you were here, looked at our collection of ketubot and looked at Jewish interaction with their neighbors through the art and language of these Jewish marriage contracts. So I really hope your appetite is whetted for what we have both in the drawer and what we're producing and discussing tonight. But for the evening at hand, you are lucky, we're all lucky, that we are welcoming Professor Elisheva Carlebach from Columbia University, our 7th Sims Katz Fellow, as well as the David B. Ruderman Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the Katz Center. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here. And her proper introduction will be done the next in line by Josh Duplitsky right here. But before I leave the details and an introduction to the substance and the extraordinary contributions of Professor Carlebach, I want to say 2 things. One, just to reiterate, if you have questions online, if you're online, hi. If you have questions, type them in. We'll get to them as best as we can. No, 3 things. 2, there's a reception after this. It'll be in that corner of the building. I hope you'll join us. And 3, on behalf of the Katz Center, I really want to give our sincere thanks to the Jewish Studies program for sponsoring this event, as well as to Brigitte Weinsteiger, the interim director, I'll learn her name, she's new, of the Penn's Library for her continued support of this fellowship. Right, the benefits of this collaboration extend well beyond tonight's lecture, and we are really deeply grateful for this opportunity to bring us and all of you together this evening. Thank you. And Josh, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I want to extend my thanks as well to all of the sponsors and co-sponsors. A gathering like this is, I think, made all the more meaningful in these difficult times to celebrate and appreciate and investigate the richness of Jewish past, not only tragedy. It gives me great personal pleasure to have the opportunity to be the one who stands here to welcome Professor Elisheva Carlebach to our campus today for this distinguished lecture. My notes say I suspect, but I actually know it's a fact that Professor Carlebach would prefer me to stop the introduction here, and yet I'm going to claim my indulgences all the same. Professor Carlebach is the Selo V'Tamar Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society at Columbia University, where she specializes in the cultural, intellectual, and religious history of the Jews in early modern Europe. Professor Carlebach's publications, and they are numerous, treat Jewish history in the fullness of its long textual traditions, but always within the deep historical specificity of the wider contexts in which Jews operated, partook of, and co-created. Her books include The Pursuit of Heresy from 1990, which was awarded the National Jewish Book Award, Divided Souls from 2000, and Palaces of Time, Jewish Calendar and Culture in Early Modern Europe, winner of the Association for Jewish Studies Schnitzer Prize. I also want to single out the majestic collection of sources that Professor Carlebach edited, compiled, and had translated in the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization's 6th volume, Confronting Modernity, 1750 to 1880, a trove of riches for exploring the Jewish past. I was going to continue on with the list of fellowships, but decided that rather than emphasize the numerous fellowships that Professor Carlebach has held, I wanted to highlight instead, just for a moment, the formative role that she has played and continues to play in the often less visible but supremely significant work of creating conditions for others, for emerging and advancing scholars to produce new scholarship on their own. She has served as editor of the Association for Jewish Studies Review, has chaired the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History, has served as the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and is currently the director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia. And she regularly and constantly makes time for others, including once upon a time, a very clueless undergraduate who was the beneficiary of an hour of her time on the steps of the Columbia Library some 20 years ago. In her exciting oeuvre of books and essays, Professor Carlebach displays erudition not only in bringing to life texts and stories that might otherwise have eluded our attention as historians, but she also breathes fresh life into sources once thought to be well-trodden ground, generating paradigms that significantly reshape essential materials that used to form the bedrock of what we think we know. The record books that Professor Carlebach will discuss today represent one such source, and I, and we, eagerly await learning from this approach. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carlebach.
Wow, after those introductions, need we say more? Thank you so very much. It is both a luxury and an obligation, as Josh just said before, to continue to pursue our work during such difficult times in the world. And I also wanted to note, while we're on a kind of sad note, the passing this week of Professor Natalie Zeman Davis, who was, for me and for many other early modernists, a role model, not just in her scholarship, but also in the way she mentored others far and wide in the field. She was a wonderful presence in our small early modern club, and she will be very much missed. I want to thank all of those who had a role in inviting me to deliver the Sims Katz lecture. I am so honored and pleased to be here. To all those who worked so hard to make my visit to Penn as comfortable as possible, Dr. Lynn Ransom of the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, Dr. Arthur Quiron, who could not be here this evening, but curator of the library at the Katz Center, Professor Joshua Teplitsky, the Joseph Meyerhoff Associate Professor of Modern Jewish History and Director of the Jewish Studies Program at Penn. I have such nachas just saying those titles. Dr. Natalie Dorman, the Associate Director of the Katz Center, and to all of you here this evening who made the effort to attend despite suspecting that the lecture wouldn't be quite as sexy as the title. Thank you. So in 1766, the people of Denmark celebrated the ascent to the throne of King Christian VII. We know today that Christian's judgment was impaired by mental illness. In those days, he was simply considered mad. At the time, a decision he made infuriated his Christian subjects. He decided to visit the great synagogue in his port city of Altona as his first stop in the inaugural tour of the city. And this is a description of that visit. On Wednesday night, 12 Tammuz, 1767, our pious king, may his glory be exalted, Christian VII, bestowed favor on the Jews in that he came here to the great synagogue with all his counselors and royal nobility. He arrived at 10:30 at night. The order of the synagogue was as follows. On all the chandeliers, white wax candles illumined. On the bench opposite the Holy Ark, we placed the seat for the king, called the throne of velvet, topped by a large silver crown with 4 silver pillars beside it. There were many seats of green velvet across from that of the king. There was also a chair of red velvet, and upon that chair was a pillow of red velvet. And upon it, we placed the Pinkas. This description of the supreme effort by the Jewish community of Altona to produce a splendid reception for a visit by their new king of Denmark appears to be the apotheosis of an object here called a Pinkas, essentially a notebook. The description goes on to elaborate. The Pinkas was a blank book into which communal craftsmen inserted white silk pages, each containing 54 lines and each inscribed with a poem. What would such a gift have looked like? I haven't been able to locate the object itself in the Royal Danish Library yet. I'm an optimist, but we can piece together some idea from similar items produced in the 18th century. So here, for example, is a Yiddish book of charms, of skulot, bound in red velvet. A wedding poem bound in red velvet and printed on white silk. And a gift actually created for an emperor, Franz Joseph. It contains an old manuscript in a mid-19th century case and gilt red leather case with the gilt imprint. The description of the royal Pinkas comes from another volume, also called a Pinkas, one with a far different purpose and appearance. It is the record kept by the Jewish civic scribe of Altona in a long rectangular merchant's account book. His cursive script covered nearly every available space in this originally blank book of paper pages and plain brown cardboard binding. He inscribed this running record of communal events in order to create an aide-memoire, le zikaron, to remember, in case he needed to recall details in the course of his many tasks within the community. Coming in the last third of the 18th century, the choice of a volume called a Pinkas, a notebook, as an offering to the king allows us to focus on the form, by now a ubiquitous artifact of the writerly world. Notebooks were widely used to keep records in early modern Jewish communities of Western Europe. Now, I'm not a monocausalist when it comes to phenomena like the expansion of writing. I don't believe, for example, that the popularity of Christianity in antiquity was primarily due to the fact that Jews retained scrolls rather than moving on to the codex. I think there were other things involved, but it surely helped. And I won't argue that the availability of blank books spurred the rise of record keeping, but it probably facilitated it, or perhaps the reverse. A great deal of recent literary scholarship has focused on the concept of affordances, the possibilities and limitations inherent in material forms. Blank notebooks in all sizes and shapes became the space for organizing slips such as commonplace excerpts, business records, scholarly musings, and scientific observations. From the most mundane functions of daily living to the most important political regulations and records, notebooks served as an organizing technology. This technology itself was cross-cultural and cross-religious. Many students and record keepers began by purchasing sheets of paper and learning to fold into bifolia and ultimately gatherings, material which they could then assemble and later bind. So you can see that here. The enlargement shows somebody in the process of doing exactly what we just described. But for busy civic scribes, pre-bound paper notebooks provided multiple advantages over single sheets. They bore no overt markings beyond the watermarks. The cardboard covers could be overbound with more substantial or luxurious materials, or left as they were with a title inked on or pasted over. Jews of Europe purchased and used them without any hesitation. The rise of Jewish record keeping and its material appurtenances could take us in many directions. Individuals kept notebooks of all kinds. Semi-official associations and quasi-governmental bodies kept records. By simply enumerating the ways in which writing to remember, rather than for literary or didactic purposes, had become ubiquitous from the 16th century, we can trace the ways in which written record creation spread beyond scholarly, mercantile, and scientific uses. People kept written notes and lists for a wide variety of purposes. Some examples of this include laundry lists that survive from the early modern period in Yiddish. There are at least two that I found from the 16th century in Yiddish. This one attempted to alleviate the perpetually boring necessity for the female head of household to keep track of the items of clothing that were given out to be laundered. In the days of homespun, every sock and handkerchief were valuable, and the big wash took several days each month. During that time, most articles of clothing, particularly undergarments, were sent out of the household. Here's the page for Kinderhemder, children's shirts, schlechte, the damaged ones. Apparently, there were also good ones. Almost 3 centuries later, another Yiddish blank book became a Wäschbichel, a laundry notebook with the same goal. It was made for a bride in the early 19th century. So this is the title page of this manuscript laundry book. And here you can see a little better. It's alphabetical according to the Yiddish order of the articles organization. So you just flipped to, say, the page for shirts or whatever it was. There's tzitzis, there's a bathrobe. That's the first thing there, a badmantel. And then you recorded on, you circled the number of how many of those items you gave out that day. A booklet containing hundreds of prescriptions and charms with a few blank pages allowed a young girl to scribble her name, Serla, daughter of Gelche, on one page, and her writing lessons on another. I don't think she was the copyist of the primary contents, but one of the beauties of notebooks was the opportunity presented by a blank page and the evidence of human activity we find there. Some women and men kept family records and sacred books. So here's a woman who is noting in the back of a prayer book the birth of her 7 children over several folios. I cite these examples among many others to illustrate what I see as the democratization of record keeping among ordinary Jews of early modern Europe. A second tier of what we can call semi-private, semi-official record keeping by individuals or societies who owned their records, but often fulfilled roles in the larger community. So rabbis, for example, kept notebooks filled with queries addressed to them. Circumcisers and midwives were the primary recorders of births among Jews in the early modern period. And I would like to begin with an example taken from the library here, a Pinkas Mohel, the record book of a circumciser from Alsace, from Bischheim, held in the Katz Center Library, and kind thanks to Dr. Arthur Quiron for pointing it out to me. So this is an amazing example from the late 18th century, and it illustrates what you might call a scribe-author model. The Mohel didn't only record the names and dates of boys he circumcised. He also wrote about events taking place at the time of his travels, leaving an indelible record, for example, of circumcisions that he performed under the strained circumstances of the wars that took place just after the French Revolution in the last decades of the 18th century. And I had occasion to notice, this is another interest of mine, that whenever he performed a circumcision on what was called an illegitimate child whose father was unknown, he says, and I named the baby Isaac, son of Abraham. So if you know any Isaac's son of Abraham, be suspicious. In some places, private Mohel records could become retroactive public evidence, not only for legal claims, but for arriving at approximate Jewish population counts. There was no place to register births. The state didn't do it yet. Churches didn't baptize Jewish children. Nobody actually kept count of births other than midwives and circumcisers. none of whom actually controlled the birth records for an entire single area. These were very peripatetic people. They traveled around. Midwives similarly kept personal records that were sometimes requisitioned by communal leaders for comparable purposes. So this is the opening folio of a midwife's record. This is her introduction with Hebrew and Yiddish in facing columns. And she writes that she recorded the births of her non-Jewish clients in a separate notebook in Dutch. In this notebook alone, she presided over some 800 births. This was a very prolific midwife. Beyond individuals, voluntary associations within the community constitute a second layer of semi-official record keepers. Charitable organizations, burial societies, synagogues, and study circles, among others, often commissioned and retained written records of their founding ordinances, membership lists, and ongoing business. Foremost among these were the societies that cared for the dead, the Chevra Kadisha and undertakers. Beyond that, communities with large enough populations had voluntary societies for every welfare and educational purpose imaginable. These societies kept regulations and registers of membership, and at their heyday in the early modern period, they were often elite and selective. Some commissioned magnificent volumes in which to enshrine their records, while others seem informal and unprofessional. Now, this sacred society in Moravia depicted the upstanding conformist members on top, while the rebellious member is depicted as being cast downward into hell. Now, this is not the naked I refer to in the title, but you can't say I didn't deliver. Now, the inscription reads, "These recalcitrant members who dared open their mouths against the officials of the society should be appropriately punished." That's one of the central inscription. The two men in the middle there are depicted as stoning the irreverent society members who disrespected the officials of the Chevra. Watch out. Of all the record-keeping efforts, however, Pinkasei Kahal, the logbooks created at the behest of Jewish communal leaders, remain most central to historians' concerns. The written records commissioned by Jewish communal leaders arose alongside sophistication of Jewish governance hierarchies and the general efflorescence of Jewish record-keeping in the early modern period. Over the course of some 3 centuries, from the mid-16th through the 18th, virtually every Jewish community across Europe, Ashkenazic Jewish community, began to keep written records of many aspects of Jewish communal life. They were long believed to be centered on dry administrative concerns, but they turn out to be gold mines for social history. Over time, some of these communities amassed sizable Jewish archives. By the late 17th to early 18th century, these were generally kept in pre-bound notebooks. Indeed, some communal officials added the cost of such blank books to the tally of their expenses. So the very top line here reads, "I bought this Buch, I bought this notebook for 8 Dutch 2 Stuyver pieces." You can correct my Dutch. In another ledger, the first 2 items, the enlargement is of the top of the right side. And again, the first 2 items are a new blank book, Kaniti Pinkas Hadash, followed by 2 printed Bibles, and apparently the new ledger cost more than the Bibles. Purchasing entire pre-bound notebooks afforded scribes the ability to control the whereabouts of the content. Communal civic scribes, shamashim, pre-foliated the entire notebook before entering any content to prevent, or at minimum to expose, purposeful tearing out of pages containing content that offended some individual. For example, when a man named Wolf Barmeyer Cohn took a folio out of the Pinkas of the treasurers in Altona, the matter aroused great consternation and spurred an investigation. The rise of civic scribal writing constituted a novum in Jewish literature, an entirely new cultural form. These scriveners invented new locutions to describe and name bureaucratic entities, objects, and ideas that had not been employed earlier in a Jewish context or language. The term Pinkas itself derives from the Greek via the Talmud, but how to form an entry, what needed to be written, whom to entrust with communal secrets like people's incomes, how to train them. This entire record-keeping apparatus did not exist before the 16th century, yet it became ubiquitous within a few short decades. For example, in Frankfurt am Main, a single bound volume contained many of the important ordinances, agreements, notes, and lists of all types. Members, records of elections of leaders, minutes of meetings, assessments of worth, taxes levied and collected, marriage permits granted, acquisition and upkeep of communal structures, and much, much more. Eventually, particularly in larger communities, some of these functions were separated into individual record books, such that an entire archive that had been contained in one codex was now divided into individual volumes to represent the multiple functions they served. Pinkasim mark the rise of a new class of Jewish writers, not the ritual scribes of old, but scribe authors, as Matthew Fisher termed them. These men commingled Hebrew and Yiddish to form a new bureaucratic lingo. While most Ashkenazi Pinkasim were written in Hebrew cursive script, the language itself was not rabbinic or any other form of literary Hebrew. Aside from Yiddish and Hebrew, they contained admixtures of the local vernaculars, such as dialects of Danish, Dutch, French, German, Hungarian, Polish, with scatterings of rabbinic Aramaic, making frequent appearances. The mixture resulted in a new register of language, a Jewish hybrid different from the formalism of rabbinic Hebrew, from standard literary forms, as well as from vernacular writing. Their frequent and ubiquitous recourse to abbreviations and acronyms, like academic jargon, saved them time and effort, as well as space on the page, but they also contributed to making the documents opaque to inexperienced readers while remaining perfectly legible to the intended circle. When we contemplate this new genre in Jewish writing, it behooves us to pause for a moment and ask, what was the context into which this development was born? Great gaps remain in the records and in our scholarship. We don't know when the first Pinkas, Jewish civic record of this type, came into being, who devised it, how it was conceived. The seemingly spontaneous rise of a new genre demands that we look closer for contextual developments that can explain its birth. The closest analog to early modern Jewish Pinkasim are Stadtbücher, city books, as I will call them, that every municipal administration in Europe kept from the High Middle Ages and continued to cultivate into the early modern period. Jews were, of course, familiar with imperial and national court and diplomatic systems, but Jewish community record books come closest to those of cities. Originally located in the need to collect and store privilegia granted to urban groups or owners of towns by imperial or royal charters, these vital document collections grew over time. The description of 14th and 15th century city books align very closely, both on the level of format as well as content, with the record books of Jewish communities. City books always opened with their founding privileges and contained statutes, regulations, tax records, receipts, inventories, lists of citizens, letters of appointment, and so forth. Each of the city books in Central Europe was distinctive in its details, yet in the aggregate, they present similar patterns. It might not be a coincidence that in one of the oldest surviving Jewish communal record books, that of Friedberg, which contains entries from as early as the early 1530s, one Jewish civic scribe referred to the book he was writing as a sefer, not as a pinkas. And I think that is a direct translation of the German word Buch, itself a technical term for a notebook of some 25 to 75 pages. Today, many of the city book collections have been printed with modern, scholarly, critical apparatus, and they're very useful for imagining the context in which Jewish civic scribal culture arose. So we can begin with the example of Regensburg, one of the most important urban centers of the Habsburg Empire. A rich urban scribal culture took root in the city, perhaps more intense than in others, as it was the meeting place for the imperial diet and a trade crossroads. Two outstanding city books were created and assembled over this period, reaching into the late 15th and being used in the 16th century. Now, Regensburg was home to a flourishing Jewish community until 1519, and Jewish names and cases figure prominently throughout the documentary sources. Regensburg's Jews entered into contracts and brought litigation before the city's officers on a regular basis. They would have been acquainted with many of the aspects of judicial and scribal culture in the city. When the city expelled its Jews in 1519, they dispersed to points east and west, carrying with them these cultural traditions. Regensburg's city books were known among the scribes and the people by affectionate terms based on their outstanding material features. For example, the color of their bindings. So the yellow city book of Regensburg, there's the red book and the black book. And you'll notice, by the way, something that only struck me afterwards, which is not only the color of the binding, but the hairiness, which means that we're looking at a skin that was not quite cleaned, which is apparently not uncommon. And the same is true, by the way, of Regensburg's black book. Other cities similarly had distinctive bindings for their city books. In this miniature illustrating Hamburg's city council meeting in the early 16th century, and you could see where the blue arrow is pointing at the book, and here focusing on that detail enlarged. It's clearly depicted as red, and a later city book in the same city in Hamburg was similarly bound and named. It is in this context, exploring the affectionate names based on their material features that were bestowed upon these well-used logbooks, that I came upon the hairy and the naked, terms coined in what was then the late medieval German city of Breslau. The hairy book was bound in raw pig skin with its hair side out, while the naked book had no binding. Similar designations were common to other city books, and Jewish Pinkasim sometimes adopt similar names. For example, I have found several green books, several references to green books in different cities, to yellow books, and many that discuss the quality and character of their community as being enshrined in their Pinkas. The material in cities' books was often gathered on the pages, such that an entire set of documents or events pertaining to them might be found in one section for ease of future reference. The Friedberg Pinkas, which is, as I said, the one that contains the earliest references, was similarly organized in certain places around common themes. So in this book, chronological order played little role. The entries were grouped around themes or events, sometimes a decade or more apart, all on the same page, which means that if you could look at the Friedberg example, the scribes left plenty of empty space in their notebooks so that they could add relevant entries at a later time. Other such finding aids found their way, of course, into books, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Here's an alphabetical index again from the 18th century. Many entries in city books opened by noting that they were being written as testimony or to be remembered, exactly the same words that Jewish scribes use when inscribing their entries, lezikaron. Similarly, when they copy, they say word for word, in German Wort zu Wort, and then in Hebrew again, milah b'milah, or ot b'ot, letter for letter, to indicate the exact copying. We could enumerate dozens of similar small evidences, if you will, small testimonies to vocabulary commuting from one community to the other. So while the exact model and genesis of the Jewish genre remains obscure, the city books provide an excellent contextual dimension for understanding the rise and character of Jewish city records. Now, I don't know what my time allocation is, but I could skip some things. No? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I wanted to also point out was the question of ownership. Who did these books belong to? The city council owned and stored the Stadtbuch, the city book. We know, for example, from the work of Laurie Nussdorfer, that public notaries in 17th century Rome were actually scribes who worked for themselves, who kept copies of documents, and you as a customer were required to go to them and order a copy if you needed it or if you needed to consult it. And these were called public notaries. By contrast, Jewish Pinkasim and many of the documents stored with them belonged to the Kahal, the lay leaders. In 17th and 18th century Altona, a locked strongbox containing Kahal records, the Tevat HaKahal, was kept in the meeting room of lay leaders, the Cheder HaKahal. However, the line between public and private records was not too strictly observed. A public announcement from 1728 in the Altona synagogue recorded the Pinkas of public announcements requested whoever has documents in their possession that belong to the Kahal, or even if they don't belong to the Kahal, but merely pertain to the Kahal, including those presently serving as communal leaders, must send these documents back in the next 8 days, or the great ban will be invoked against them. This announcement shows that the Kahal divided documents into several classes, but also we know that the prohibition forbidding any leader to remove documents to their personal premises was manifestly violated. When one leader died, I read in the inventory of his belongings, there was a box. Within it, we laid a packet which was labeled writings belonging to the Kahal, and we sealed it with the notarial seal. In Altona, when the communal executive secretary, Rabbi Chaim, passed away, his effects were inventoried, and we learned from that he lived in rooms owned by the community and that he kept certain community records with him in his rooms. His boxes of possessions were found next to and behind the room used by the tax assessors. When the sealed effects were distributed to his heirs, the notary who made the inventory said, several of the sealed items containing the writings of the community, we left them sealed, and I took them to my own home, and they are with me. Thus, the written records that the deceased scribe had left behind in his personal living space were now moved to his successor's personal living space. Jewish communal scribes also blurred the lines between public and private ownership of communal records, and we can see this from an example here in which a communal record bears in its flyleaf and then in its opening page, opening folio, personal notes. When his various relatives died, others use it for similar types of notes, and that certain records belong both to individuals and to the community can be demonstrated from the case of another circumciser, Man Bar Moses, who requested that the records that he kept over 5 decades of circumcising baby boys be buried with him. The community honored his request, but not before the secretary and notary of the community made from his handwritten original a truly faithful copy, with the seal of that copyist still affixed to it. Small slips of paper preserved within Pinkasim of all types, from the long-running Pinkas of Frankfurt. So here you see a little slip pasted into the page of the Pinkas, point to the way civic records were produced in early modern scribal circles. Writers of records didn't always carry the official ledger with them. This would have exposed the entire archive in a volume to all the dangers of the road, loss, theft, weather, water damage, and the like. Instead, the permanent record remained in its regular, secure place. The scribe, notary, or other record keeper would write on small portable slips of paper. So they're all over. Every time you open one of these Pinkasim, one of the exciting things are these little pieces of paper that come fluttering out. The scribes likely carried a portable writing chest, kind of mobile desk for literate women and men, in addition to space for storing blank and written notes. They often had quills, nibs, inks, seals, sealing wax, and all the things they needed in order to carry out their duties. And then at the end of the day, or as soon as possible, they would copy the information from the slips into the notebooks, but sometimes they forgot or didn't bother. So, if it is correct that civic city books of late medieval Europe provide a model or context for Pinkasim, we might well ask, what aspects of the genre were distinctly Jewish, and what is new or significant about them? I mean, if they're just Yiddish versions of city books, are they really interesting? It isn't just the fact of Jews' participation in their own key in the archival moment in Europe. It is that where Jews were treated as an other in the archives of empires and towns alike, their cases often distinguished by the labels on their dossiers, such as Juden Akten, and that still is the way many archivists categorize them. In Jewish records, it is the non-Jews who are called out as the others. Jews are the agents of their own little polity, the actors rather than the subjects. Their communal records represent the agency and authorship of their leaders and designated representatives. If one were to venture further into the political and perhaps psychological territory of the symbolic meaning of the material texts, one could interpret the material aspect of Pinkasim as making a statement about the minor or subaltern political role of Jews within the larger polities in which their kehilot were situated. This is what I mean by not formal aspect. The inexpensive paper notebooks into which so much communal business was inscribed, the deliberate assignment of the communal scribal function to people who were generally less trained than court scribes or ritual scribes, Safra de Dayana or Sofre Stam, the ad hoc aspect of many Pinkasim made a statement about how Ashkenazic Jewish communities perceived their place in the larger political world. The records project an ambiguous message. Internally, they radiate political awareness and even sufficiency, while externally they appear opaque or insular. The value of these records for general historians lies precisely in this ambiguity. Jewish archives, like their creators, were distinctly Jewish while being simultaneously embedded within the cultures of record keeping in the societies around them. Having laid out some of these features, we can ask, do Jewish records matter to the larger story of European archival culture? In his recent book on European archivalities, Making Archives in Early Modern Europe, Randolph Head issued a plea to begin looking more broadly. Jewish record keeping can provide something of a comparative dimension, a way to observe archival pluralism at work. For all their agency, Jewish communities were exploited for the benefit of the states that tolerated them. The state archive existed to control, categorize, and define these minorities, in other cases, indigenous people, so that they could be dominated. In all these cases, we have to read the dominant voices against their grain to begin to experience the voice of the subordinated people. The archives of Jews in pre-modern Europe allow historians to imagine what archives would look like if they weren't dedicated to upholding the nation state. They allow us to hear their concerns in their own voices and their own hand. So I'd like to share this final image with you, which I imagine as a counterpoint to the first text we read. Unlike the fawning reception directed at a king, an internal prayer for the welfare of the government in a Siddur, in the cantor's liturgy, contains the sloppily erased name of an earlier ruler in favor of the city fathers. Thank you.
Yeah. While Natalie's getting the microphone, and I ask you to speak into the microphone when you're asking questions so
Yes,
that people
yes.
on Zoom can hear. There's lots to say. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, for bringing these documents so vividly to life. Like I said, there's a lot to say, but I think there are lots of questions, and I already have 2 questions in the chat. So maybe I'll start with one of those, and then you can move to the audience. Okay, great. So the first one is from Tanya Tulson. Can Professor Carlebach provide an example of Jewish record keeping in defiance of the supervening Christian majority and explain its significance to understanding this area of research? I think think you sort of might have touched on your conclusion, but if you want to add to that.
So there's an entire, if you will, sorry, unwritten, sometimes you'll see, and those who know, or those who understand, or I can't go into this because those who know will understand. Very often those are directed at some type of either accusation or activity that was happening within the Jewish community. This is not a question of defiance of the local authority, but simply reservations about expressing in public things that might have been prohibited or looked upon with disfavor.
Well, I have one question while we're waiting. I'm fascinated by the circumciser and the midwife, and that these are unofficial documents, that births are not being recorded. I'm interested if the state went to look at those, kind of like how cops get people's nest footage now off their front doorstep. But it leads me to believe that, leads me to ask, what was the unit of interest of the state? Was it not the individual? Was it the kahal? Why aren't births being recorded?
Okay, so I do want to say something. Jordan Katz is writing a book about midwife records, and she's focusing on the Netherlands because there midwives were actually licensed and required to keep meticulous records. And the example I brought was actually from a Dutch Jewish midwife, but there are many others. I don't believe that all of them were literate enough to even keep records. There simply wasn't that central state function of maintaining vital records. And it really isn't until the later early modern period when economists began to understand that population growth was a good thing and that keeping track of births and deaths of children was something that would contribute in the long run to the health of the nation state, that you begin to get this interest in how many. Now, again, going all the way back, there's another motive, and that is to reduce the population of Jews in a certain area, or to control it, to say no more than X number of Jews will be permitted to live in this place over a certain time. So there again, records had to be kept. But there was actually no mechanism for keeping them. Again, circumcisers traveled all over, sometimes quite large distances, crossing different political boundaries. So what is the value of this record? It's a really interesting question, and one of the reasons why it's so difficult to give numbers of population for Jews in the pre-modern period. We just don't know.
Among the many fascinating things you have told us, I would like to return with what you said about the new genre that the writing in the Pinkassim meant for the scribes. That is, you said that suddenly it was no longer rabbinical, it was no longer a commentary, it was whatever it was. It had a literariness, which meant the invention of new words and perhaps new forms of narratives. I don't know. So my question is this: as this group of writers formed, and I'd love to know also how this new knowledge was transmitted, do you have any evidence that this new form of Hebrew writing led to literary secular forms of writing, such as history or chronicling? So that's my question.
Well, thank you. That's a richer question than the answer I could provide in brief, because I myself am looking for some of the answers to these questions. Who trained these people to write the way they wrote? For example, to begin an entry with a date, to then write the body of the entry, to sometimes sign it. These are forms that are learned. How did they learn? I have different theories. Eventually, interestingly, this becomes a sinecure, very often passed on from father to son. There are, in Amsterdam, for example, you can really lose your mind trying to keep track of Leib ben Ozer, Ozer ben Leib, going through a century and a quarter of civic scribes in the Ashkenazi community of Amsterdam. You have something similar in Frankfurt with the Schwarzschild dynasty, and in Altona, Hamburg, at least 3 generations of Lelevs were scribes. So at a certain point, it becomes something like passed on knowledge that's transmitted within the family, but there may have been other things that I don't know. I refer you to Roni Cohen's article. Is that in JQR? No, I don't remember where it was published, but I can easily find it for you. About a young boy, about 12 years old, who dreamed of becoming a scribe. We don't see that he ever actually practiced, but he writes about how he filled notebooks with examples, how he obtained things with examples. So there are, again, there's no school for scribes. There's no scriptoria the way you have in medieval Christian culture for Jews, something that recently departed and lamented Malachi Bet Aryeh often discussed. And as far as this leading to other types of writing, like chronicling, without question, it's there. There's a seed of chronicling events in some of these Pinkasim, most nicely in the Bishheim Moel Pinkas. Several times he writes, this war was happening between the French and the Germans, and this regiment was coming by, and I was trying to do my circumcision and concentrate it while I heard the guns shouting outside. So yes, there's an element of chronicling. I don't know if this is, again, what gives rise to historical writing among Jews, but it's certainly adjacent to it. And maybe think about Leib ben Ozer, for example, who wrote the Beschreibung von Shabtai Tzvi, an entire volume in which he describes the entire movement, which he was witness to. There are scribe authors who write histories. Again, I'm not sure how strong that link is completely. I just would add one other thing, which is that the term Pinkas, as the descriptive term for a book that encapsulates the DNA of a community, came to be used for Holocaust memorial books that stand as monuments to lost communities. It's Pinkas such and such. So the term itself lived on even after civic scribes were not doing it anymore for the same recording purpose.
Thank you for this talk. You noticed in the course of going through the documents that you discussed a series of antinomies or contrasts that sort of leap out to the modern eye. So these documents often contain printed text next to handwritten text, and they seem to mingle easily between print culture and scribal culture. You notice that in many of the Pinkasim, community records would be mingled with private notations, genres that, again, to our eye, don't seem to belong together. There seems to be some mixture of Hebrew and Yiddish, and the decision about what to use when wasn't always clear. My question to you is, when do these start to appear to the keepers, the producers and consumers of these documents, as genres that maybe don't belong together? When does our sense of strange mingling start to be their sense?
Okay, thank you for that question, although I will say I did not use the word print once in my entire talk. But it is true that not so much in these writings, which are all handwritten, all the Pinkasim are written completely by hand from beginning to end, but documents are being pre-printed in this period. So, for example, wills, most popularly marriage contracts, loan documents. There's an entire genre of what you could call in Hebrew shtarot, contracts that are beginning to be pre-printed, and just the details get populated by hand. And you will find those types of records often kept or stored together with other communal records. So for example, if a person dies and leaves a bequest to the community, I would like to provide this endowment for 5 orphans to be married off every 3 years. The community must keep a copy of that record because it pertains to them. So that will, that last will and testament, is not just a private transaction, it is also of the public interest. So those things become mingled. There's absolutely no real sense in this period yet of a strict separation between print and handwritten. This is something, again, that has been greatly discussed in the scholarship. The order between print and script, and the way even today we keep manuscripts separate from printed books, is a distinction that would have mostly escaped early moderns.
Right, so I have another question from the chat from Mary, who doesn't give a last name. How did these rare manuscripts survive the world wars and other upheavals? And was Yiddish or Hebrew dominant in these Pinkasim? And did this change over centuries? Just 2 questions.
Okay, so thank you for the questions. In some of them, Hebrew dominates, and in some of them, Yiddish dominates. Many are aspirationally Hebrew. That means they start out with Hebrew, but quickly devolve into Yiddish, which is the lingua franca of most Ashkenazic Jews across the borders. And that's pretty much when they talk about, for example, what prayers or the order of the prayers in the synagogue, which is not an element of every Pinkas, but it is of some. You'll see Hebrew, you'll see, again, rabbinic flourishes. And then when you talk about, this man got cursed out by that man's wife the other day, and we're going to find them, that's all in Yiddish, sometimes with the curse words, sometimes without. As for survival, many of them didn't survive. What we have is what did. That needs to be said. So much of our literary heritage didn't survive, didn't make it. So we always have to know that there's a bigger picture, and that we're looking at small pieces of a large puzzle. That said, many of these books survived by extraordinary acts of either foresight by people who knew. There's a whole book about the struggle of Yivo, for example, to get much of its material out of Eastern Europe in the teeth of the Nazi onslaught. In Hamburg-Altona, another very interesting thing happened. The Jews gave their records to the library, and the library kept it safe for them. And of course, after the war, there was a lawsuit over who these records belonged to. The Jewish community itself didn't exist anymore. And those Jews who individually survived wanted to see the materials transferred to Israel, whereas the city said, these are Hamburg records, you gave them to us to entrust them, they belong here. In the end, they were able to reach a Solomonic decision to split the archive in half, but also to, in those days, microfilm the entire thing, and each party would get half of the original documents with the other half on microfilm. And that's the way it is until this day.
I see two questions around here. Aya?
Thank you so much. This is very rich. Your case of the individual who tore a page out of the Pinkas in the ensuing trial raises the question of who had access to the Pinkas and under what circumstances would it be consulted?
So thank you for that question. These were not public documents. Not everybody could come and just examine them the way you can perhaps today in a library. They belonged to the elected lay leaders of a community. And these were essentially records of their decisions, their regulations, and then violations of those decisions and how they were dealt with. So that's how you get all this social history coming into what often starts out as a pretty cut and dried set of rules. But then you talk about human life and the street and how these rules are or are not observed. And that's where you get other things. But again, they were kept under lock and key in a special box in a special room. There are many references to those things. And despite that, people with influence, sometimes the elected lay leaders themselves, would ask to borrow it. I was just looking into a case that needed to be decided between 3 communities. And so the records of 3 communities had to be removed from their space and brought to one central location. And then the judges, the rabbinic judges, were supposed to adjudicate a case between them as to who owed whom money and so forth. And really interestingly, the judges are accusing one another of absconding with this record or that record. So how do you expect us to come to a decision when so-and-so took those records home with him and hasn't brought them back for months? So you again, there's no central repository. And people often did have access who shouldn't have. And sometimes that's noted in the record itself, and many times it just isn't.
Thank you. To return to the question about the new cultural form, given that so much of your beautiful argument here is constructed out of the materiality of these texts, do you have any sense of the interreferentiality of these texts with others? If there's a difference between a Pinkas and a Sefer, a record book and a learned treatise, are there any forms of competition between them? Do the authors of some and the authors of other relate to one another? Are there competitions over the authority enshrined in each, or the authority that each generates for their holders, writers? How do these books relate to other books, if at all?
Okay, so first of all, there's a lot of internal cross-referencing, and you'll often find, as it says in the old Pinkas, they don't tell you which old one, which is very frustrating. We decide or deliberate or do the following. So within this system itself, scribes are referring from one book to the next. Sometimes judges in a case cannot find the original regulation that the person, the litigant before them, is being judged. And they say, he violated this infraction, but we can't actually find the place where the law was ever written down originally. So, like, what do we do unless we can find the regulation? We're going to have to let them go. Or if the counter, if the plaintiff can find the regulation, then we can find the defendant in a certain way. So there is a sense, again, of the books themselves referring to themselves. As to their competition with others, I think that you'll find sometimes in rabbinic literature references to Pinkasim. For example, a Jewish divorce contract has to be meticulously written. Every name, including the names of places, have to be spelled exactly correctly, or as famously parodied in modern Hebrew literature about the little tiny tip of a yud, or the divorce contract is not valid, and the woman is therefore not free to remarry. So these spellings of place names, and many of these place names, do you spell it the Hebrew way, or do you spell it the Yiddish way with certain letters as phonetic guide markers to how you pronounce it? How do you know? Who decides? The Pinkas decides. The way the city spells its name in Hebrew or Yiddish in the Pinkas is the way the divorce contract should be written. So, so there is some cross-referencing, but it's not antagonistic. I think it's mutually supporting.
Let's take one last question from the interwebs, and then we can go have informal chat for snacks.
Person's been waiting patiently. Eric Ruskin asked that have different states. Did anything influence the choice and choice of size and shape of the Pinkasim?
So that's a great question, and one which I've been trying to think about. Certain cities had a long history. Again, Altona, which I'm particularly interested in, has these long, narrow ledgers. They look exactly like a merchant's ledger. They're not meant to carry tremendous amount of narrative material, but almost brief entries. Possibly because of its position as a commercial hub, and therefore this is what was available. And once one scribe began doing it, the others possibly just followed. Not all of them are uniform. Sometimes one scribe will use one type of shape book and the other will prefer a different paper or a different size. They're very, very variable.
Please join me in thanking Professor Carlebach for a fantastic talk.